give a clear, unambiguous signal to industry on this, because then that's loading the dice. So as a result of that, there's this delicacy. No one knows what's really being said. You have to do this and this, but why? There's a lot of kabuki on this, which maybe is driven by the nature of the processes we have, where anything you say can and will be held against you, thanks to freedom of information or access to documents acts, and so it's just a minefield for those in the hot seat on this. And since we know the consequences of this congestion are so great, this is something that has to be talked about and solved, and maybe give those, whether it's the pen holders on regulatory decisions or their staffs or the elected people, give them more confidence that they can take high-level decisions needed for society and just get things done. How exactly do we do that? I think, I wish I had the answer.
Okay, from George, and I think this is applicable to both countries. With all the land in the West owned by the feds, how can states, provinces effectively streamline permitting at the local level? Examples of forest health and certainly something we've been talking about the last few days, transmission, siting, and capacity expansions.
So one of the reforms that we're seeing, where they're both Republican and Democrat members of the House, the United States Senate, the United States House, and what we're now seeing at the state and local level is the very reforms, the Clean Water Act, or right-of-way through a National Wildlife Refuge or Forest Service or parkland for a transmission line is the same thing that was fought for 5 years ago for an LNG export or an ammonia transport facility. The changes that are now needed to meet 2030, 2040 zero carbon emission goals are now aligned with the same long linear projects that have to fight uphill, which federal lands and the ability to do right-of-way was the way in which to stop that, to prioritize a different energy source. We're no longer in that world now. The same issues afflicting a renewable transmission line are the same things afflicting a Dakota Access Pipeline or a Mountain Valley Pipeline or a traditional oil and gas delivery local distribution system. So because the incentives and the definitions of success are now aligned, if you screw over an oil pipeline, you're screwing over a renewable transmission line, and you can't do that, right? So the reality here is we have an opportunity here like we've never had before to traverse federal land and not make it an energy source debate.
Yeah, we're seeing these the same trends in Canada. I think one of the interesting things, especially in the West, is how First Nations are become empowered to make decisions that are, in many cases, regulatory in nature. Still, all the rules being followed that need to be to protect the land, and able to, as Indigenous governments, approve projects. We've seen a number of cases. I had a slide there, didn't talk about it, but LNG, liquefied natural gas opportunities in British Columbia, in the case of the Squamish First Nation, but also the Haisla First Nation in the far northwest near Kitimat, are, as nations, saying we want the development. We want to be part of this. In the past, these same nations have complained that small groups or individuals even who are disaffected by a process have been exploited by environmental groups who are looking to stop the project at any cost by whatever means available, and it so happens that there has been a rich vein of that. And I think governments have eventually said, well, the First Nations are looking for these opportunities, so get involved. Now, not every opportunity is going to be accepted, some might be refused. So in terms of the federal government and the Crown land, I mean, this is one of the big shifts of Canada right now in terms of redefining what it means for the Crown to have land, or as in the BLM here, and increasingly Indigenous territory and decisions made on those rights, which it's a positive direction for decisions, because we are seeing things happen.
Yeah, and indeed, Indigenous and First Nations economic opportunities are the subject of our sessions in Regina and Whistler. So, okay. Excuse me. Sorry. Okay, now here's a provocative question. The same people that are wanting to go to zero carbon emissions are the ones creating the biggest roadblocks with their environmental policies that they implement. How can we fix that? Alex?
So, of the IIJA money from 2021, there's a 5-year clock on that infrastructure siting money. We're already 2.5 years into that. Half of that program is undersubscribed by states. That money is going to get left on the table every program. Very similar to the $2 trillion in IRA money for states, locals, and tribes, and the tax credit side. We are now in a situation where the previous rhetorical fights, where you don't like the outcome of an election, or a pipeline, or a transmission line, so you use the process against the project because you lost in the political process. Those days are coming to a close because now that projects are this transparent and both sides have shared pain for using the process against the project that you just don't like, are no longer going to be acceptable ways to obstruct the project. And I will tell you, if you look at the litigious environment of the environmental NGOs and private property landowners that are suing projects because they just don't like that they lost in the decision-making process, are losing court cases on a variance of 7 out of 10 times. You are no longer allowed we no longer live in a black box world where everything isn't transparent. If you're holding up a project that is directly causing a 10% increase on your community's electricity prices because you don't like that it's cutting through your backyard, you're going to be held accountable for that. And so I know it's going to be an interesting transition, and again, we like to see ghosts in both sides. Like the renewable guys don't like the oil and gas guys. Both sides, the emperor's not wearing clothes anymore. The reality is that the solutions for one are going to help the other, and those that stand in the way are going to get embarrassed.
Great. Do you want to take that question?
No, I thoroughly agree. I have nothing to add there.
Okay, this is directed to you, Alex. What is the single most important action that a state legislator, there are many here, can do to impact permit reform?
Whenever I see delays, the feds point at the states point at the feds. And then the feds point at their other agency. It wasn't me, it was the Fish and Wildlife Service. They had jurisdiction over steelhead trout. No, it was National Marine Fisheries. They had jurisdiction over salmon. It's an ocean-bearing fish. Everyone likes to cast blame. Same thing happens at the state level. And so one of the more important things that I've seen in states is state legislatures, when the budget comes up, is they assign a full-time FTE that can serve as the counterparty that actually works with the tribes and the affected local community so that they can actually serve as almost like an advisor and a counterparty to move through the system, because that's where we see some of the biggest holdups is a lack of effective stakeholder input at the beginning. Because I will tell you this, community engagement is not something to be taken lightly. Projects are 0 for 50 if they don't follow the rules. The administrative record is weak. Spending money on the front end to do things that you previously didn't think you had to do are no longer the best way to build a project. An extra $2 million here to have a robust engagement and public comment period on the front end means you're not going to get sued 4 years from now. So the most important thing a state can do is A, state permitting council, so they can have a transparent, depoliticized process for moving projects across all sectors that traverse multiple election cycles so that a politician doesn't have to put their finger on the scale on one project or one sector over another. We saw this most recently with Gretchen Whitmer in Michigan with the Enbridge project coming over from Canada, Line 5. That project is going to get approved, not because Gretchen Whitmer, as a Democrat, had to approve an oil and gas pipeline. It's really essential, but at the same time, it was on the dashboard. There was an infrastructure czar coordinator. It was a designated position. It wasn't me, it was the dashboard, right? It was the state permitting council. Divorcing politicians from having to make decisions about projects is essential. The more that we can do that, it's going to make the legislators in this room, their lives much easier, and it is going to make projects less susceptible to the whims of gubernatorial election shifts. And so I think that's probably one of the most, and that's very achievable. That's not a political issue, that's a true process redesign.
Great. Stuart, Canada and the US share many waters, and often they send different signals to the marketplace. What can be done to harmonize that approach and be competitive together?
Yeah, well, I'm thinking this question points me to the transboundary issue of Alaska and British Columbia, which is a mining issue. I think it's misdefined. I don't think it's an environmental issue. Obviously, it has environmental considerations galore, but I think it's an innovation and an Indigenous opportunity story that is not being seen. Instead, it has been defined rigorously by interest groups in Washington especially, but also locally in Alaska as this issue. It's affecting decisions, it's keeping important mines and critical minerals out of the market. This should be a shining example of Canada-USA cooperation on an important economic opportunity that can be done soundly, but instead all we hear is that it's just this impossible environmental hazard, and I think that's wrong. In terms of the ocean side, I would, living in Victoria as I do, that means I look out upon the Strait of Juan de Fuca. I know when the whales are around now. This wasn't the case until a few years ago. I know the killer whales pod, J-pod, is feeding in my area because the ships are moving slower thanks to the, I think it's the ECHO program, right Robert? From the Port of Vancouver, the ports got together, so it's a voluntary ship slowdown. Didn't need to be mandated. I think it's just a great example of industry saying, yeah, that makes sense. Let's have less engine noise so those animals can enjoy their feed, and it's probably an economic cost to that. And I think this might be picked up in some places on the other side of the parallel, right? So why not have more of that? You know, I think it's, rather than the legislation, you know, I felt Bill C-48, I don't know if Senator McDonald is in the room still, but Bill C-48 with kind of a ban on a certain class, really aimed at Alberta, was very corrosive to national unity in Canada to just ban certain kinds of tankers from the West Coast. When you can have a chance for First Nations to be part of protection programs, to take it in, again, a more positive, constructive sense, a win-win, rather than these divisive solutions. So, in terms of that as a cross-border issue, I think it's really just how we can be more effective on things that are in the natural collaboration space.
I'll just make a comment. When I was working for Congressman John Miller during the Exxon Valdez disaster in 1989, we visited the Exxon Valdez, and that resulted in a bipartisan Oil Pollution Prevention Act of 1990, which resulted in double hull tankers and tug escorts, both up in Prince William Sound and at the beginning of the Strait of Juan de Fuca. Now we understand that there will be 3 rescue tugs stationed near Victoria as part of the Trans Mountain permit process. So,
yeah, salvage tugs, rescue tugs, and a whole host of other programs to ensure the safety of these vessels as they go by. And I think when I go down to the park, there's people walking their dog, and I know there's a ship. I've got the app. I know what those ships are. Oh, there's a tanker there. I know there's a tug behind it. Maybe there's a tug in front of it. I know there's a couple of pilots on board, and no one in the park is standing there worried about it. They're just enjoying the sunshine, and that's how it should be.
well, and Fred Fellman, the Port of Seattle Commissioner, was here yesterday and talking about the need to take one of those 3 tugs and put it over in the Sydney area because of the sensitivity of Harold Strait, return point. You've got to make a bunch of turns to get out, so that might be a further discussion. Alex, back to you. Has the new Department of Defense program for assisting with permitting been helpful in highlighting these issues?
Well, I mean, it's talking about using the Defense Production Act to recognize that critical minerals are, much like border security and others, are a national and primary sector, that more so than maybe transit or roads or bridges. It is helpful to an extent on the funding side, but the reality is the same obstacles that a new critical minerals mine might face, even if it's exempted from big federal National Environmental Policy Act, still has to go get 7 or 8 federal permits and 5 other local. So you're pushing the obstacles aren't going away. The thing that I think is important is it's allowing for prioritization of resources to go to technology. And for those who are in the States, and for one of the questions about what states can do, some states across the country are taking not a significant amount of money, $200,000, $300,000, $400,000, and putting out an RFP for many of the people in this room, which are consultants and management information system folks that are actually helping shore up the laborious work of getting your Department of Fire Quality, and your Lands Office, and your Fish and Wildlife Office. It's just difficult for them to even get on a Microsoft Teams Zoom call to figure out what the roles and responsibilities are. There's a way we can harness technology in the States to not only reduce the requirement on the FTEs needed to make decisions, but to work smarter, not harder, to make sure that almost like Slack, or I don't know, one of the things that kids use we can use technology to arrive at where the decisions need to be made much faster. That's what's happening with the DOT program on critical minerals. It's not taking us 3 years to get to some initial due diligence on whether or not the mine will be economically viable. We get to that decision faster.
We have 1 minute, so gentlemen, wrap up comments.
There you go first.
Yeah, I'm just looking at the last question here because that kind of ties it up nicely. You know, what are best practices if anyone is leaving here saying, okay, how am I going to be more effective as a result of what I've heard here? You know, I think having that higher level, elevating from the conflict zone into the solution space is always the way to go for any problem solving, I think. But at risk of that being a nebulous statement, how does one do that? You know, I think stating the intention you have to your publics so that there is, I think, a general move in the discourse away from just conflict talk into solution talk.
It is no longer coal versus natural gas versus wind and solar and hydro. We need all of them, and all of them are taking more than 10 years from concept to completion. The changes that you can engage in a robust and open conversation to fix now in the States is going to help everybody, because there's no way to pick one energy source over another by using the process to hold them up. The action is now, beginning of legislative sessions, beginning of next year. There's a tremendous opportunity to make real change. And you know who benefits? All of us. And this doesn't need to be a complicated tax policy, healthcare, how do we unwind it? There are real achievable things, and there's no silver bullet. So let's hit a bunch of singles, to use a baseball reference. We don't need to worry about this big global bill happening. Incrementally, the cumulative impact of doing all these small things, speeding up the process, are going to make America and our relationship with Canada a much stronger place, because we can build stuff. We can build stuff much faster. The rest of the world builds it in 2 years, and it takes us 10, and we have the cleanest and most respected environmental process in the world.
So remarkable, and I hope you find an educational session. Let's give our panel a big hand.
Wow.